Joshua, and she could not let go of her roots, native identity, and she goes on to perform goes on to perform and accept what her native people are following and dictating to her. She goes on to practice circumcision, and unfortunately, she dies. But the lack of sensitivity that the father and the family shows is highly questionable over here, because when we talk about the Orient and the Occident, the Occident had one of the major values and one of the major questions that the Occident proposed was that the Orient and the African people did not have the sense of connectivity. They had a sense of vulgarity because of the practices that were seen that are clearly mentioned in the novel, that the people were doing and celebrating the way they celebrated near the Honya River. When we talk about the Occident and calling them as the civilized and the privileged race, it is also important to mention how clearly and how unbiasedly Ngugi wa Thiongo has clearly written about how the people of the native land of Kenya were practicing these rituals with their younger generation. But unfortunately, all these people and all these generation, 90% of the children were not surviving. They were dying because of the unhygienic conditions that were proposing. Another character, Wayaki, he is the son of Sheikh, who is the self-proclaimed seer of the nation. Seer, as in in other novels, as for example, in Things Fall Apart, there's an oracle. In the same way, over here in this novel, Sheikh is the seer of the Kenyan identity. He talks about how he believes that his son will never follow the Western culture, and he will still send his son to study in Sirania because he knows his strong roots will not let his son go. But unfortunately, in the end, it is this breakaway that is the major painful event in the novel, when the son Vayaki feels that his family and his culture is degraded and is not up to the mark and is not something that he would like to follow and give forth to his future generations and his future posterity. Moving forward, there's another very important novel by Ngugi wa Thiong'o, that is A Grain of Wheat. I'll be talking about how in Grain of Wheat, the Mau Mau Rebellion, one of the major event of 1952 to 1960, a war between British and Kenyan colony, the KLFA, that is the Kenyan Land and Freedom Army, and how the people fought together, how the people were fighting to gain their independence. But because of the lack of the support by their own natives, this KLFA, or the Kenyan Land and Freedom Army, failed. It could not achieve its designated results. The detention camps that Ngugi wa Thiong'o has talked about is extremely glaring and glaring and thought provoking, because when we talk about detention camps, we generally associate with Germany and what Hitler did, but we never talk about what happened in Africa. What about the people who were dislocated from their own locality? What about the people who could not trace back their roots? What about the children who never knew whether their father or mother was alive or dead? I would also like to talk about these detention camps when we were talking about how we think it is a thing of the past. But with the current situation that is going on and with the advent of knowledge that is coming up, there are certain detention camps that are being made by the government even in the 21st century, which is glaring and the truth of today. In the novel, the mention of the Rira detention camp is actually a visual representation of what is the truth behind and what happens in these camps in the name of civilization. Starvation, death, psychological trauma, rapes, gender degradation, and double subordination is one of the few things that the people have faced in these glaring times. I had also mentioned about Homi K. Baba talking about cultural hybridity. Cultural hybridity comes in the novel River in Between when we are talking about the Yukabi men. Because as stated by Ngugi wa Thiong'o, he believed and the people and the natives believed that the hills were impenetrable. And I quote, he says, impenetrable hills of Kenya will remain strong forever, unquote. But that did not happen. With the advent of Sirania and the Western cultural identity, and with the people coming up with their own rules and regulations, breaking away from their native identity and going forward towards what the white men taught, the cultural hybridity comes in, because people like Joshua later failed to realize where they lived, where should they associate their identity with. Joshua's daughter, second daughter, the youngest daughter, who had already lost her sister, Muthoni, Nyakabi, she does not realize and she does not understand where should she go. Should she follow her in the footsteps of her sister Muthoni, or should she die like her? Should she have a future like her sister? Or should she completely break away from her colonial roots, from her identity, and go away to follow what her father is preaching? the cultural dilemma that the people were once united with is completely shattered. And that is the main question that Ngugi wa Thiongo is proposing. I had also mentioned about the idea of African slavery, and it is very important to understand that when we think that this again is a term of the past, but that is a glaring mistake on our part, because slavery is still a thing of the present. And on this note, I would like to mention a novel mention a novel by the name My Slave Story. It's the 21st century novel, and ironically, the girl who was taken as a slave had been serving in the house of a union of in the house of a UN ambassador of her own country. This was the idea of a Sudani slavery. So African slavery is not the only thing that has been focused, though there are many novels like 12 Years a Slave by Solomon Northup that have been telling about what the people have faced. But the mental and psychological trauma that the people of Africa have faced is something that is not deniable. People have to talk about it, and Ngugi wa Thiongo very well and very aptly has been proposing his ideas and themes about it. Keeping in mind the time restraint, I now ask you for questions, if there are any.
Thank you, Akshita, for your wonderful paper. We'll go into the questions at the end of the session.
Thank you.
Okay. So next we move on to our next speaker, Alan Chaco Thomas. Are you there? Alan
Yes,
Chaco Thomas.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. You will be talking on the Chocolate Civilization.
Good afternoon to the respected chairperson.
A study of othered self
Yes,
in Heart of Darkness. He is an English honors third-year student at the Vivekananda University of Professional Studies. Okay. Begin with your paper.
Good afternoon to the respected chairperson and my fellow participants. While talking about Achebe's condemnation, Joseph Conrad's racist remarks in The Heart of Darkness, we surely can't look past Achebe's brilliant work, Things Fall Apart, which gives us a raw account of the African culture and traditions showcased to us through the life of an ambitious African tribesman, Okongo. A book which came years after Conrad's Heart of Darkness and yet acts as a prequel to the imperialistic atrocities that Conrad's book displays. Joseph Conrad in his book describes Africa and Africans as the alien beings to the readers and writes about his mere surface observations about the natives. And throughout the book, he either demeans them as lesser beings or disregards them and mutes them altogether. Like in The Heart of Darkness, even before Marlowe interacts or comes in contact with any of the natives, his prejudice shapes his view of the natives. For example, when Marlowe is traveling up the river Congo and comes around a bend, he says, there would be a glimpse of rush walls, of peaked grass roofs, a burst of yells, a whirl of black limbs, a mass of hands, of stamping, of feet stamping, of bodies swaying, of eyes rolling under the droop of heavy motionless foliage. He describes them as beastly savages and less than human beings. And this is when Achebe's book, Things Fall Apart, tries to give the African culture its required identity, not through the eyes of an outsider, but through a native. As briefed earlier, the book focuses on the native culture and ends at an intense note, just when the things fall apart. My paper, titled The Chalk of Civilization, explores the creation of otherness by an outside force, that is, the colonizers into the pre-existing civilization. The title Chalk of Civilization symbolizes the binaries created on the basis of race, that is, the Europeans and the native Africans. And in the title, the word chalk represents the white men who came to the obscure continent of Africa to spread their whiteness in the form of civilization on the black slate representing the native Africans. I use chalk and slate to describe the two distinct civilizations as it symbolizes the prime method used by the colonizers, education. And the European power established churches and educational institutions to colonize the minds of the natives even before physically capturing their territories. And the creation of alterity starts to take shape as soon as the Christian missionaries start preaching to the natives and informing them about the one true God who has no shape or no form. and turns their gods as mere pieces of words, disregarding the belief system of an entire culture to introduce their own, and to create a hierarchy of belief systems and cultural practices, which furthermore problematizes the identity of the natives. And the most interesting part of the conversion in Things Fall Apart is the first ones to get converted into Christianity are the outcasts, the member of the tribe who were thrown out of the village for their wrongdoings. And here we see how alterity pre-exists in the society. They are the people with no identity to claim, and therefore they see it as a perfect lending hand to hold on to. And using the infamous trick of British colonizers of divide and rule, the act of missionaries in problematizing the identity of the people of Umofia was not only to reduce the other from the self, but also to create a sense of difference within the clan itself. This ensured that the destruction of the natives would not just be the product of external impact with the brutal force of the whites, but also by growing a sense of internal disunity. Furthermore, we see the creation of alterity from a Eurocentric point of view that we get to know from Kurtz's report in The Heart of Darkness, in which he begins with the argument that the whites, from the point of development that they arrived at, must necessarily appear to them, the natives, in the nature of supernatural beings, as we approach them with the might as of a deity. Here, by comparing the whites to deity, Kurtz over amplifies the white supremacy of over the Africans, just because of their unfamiliarity with the white race and technological advancements. He presumed that the natives would be in awe of them and welcome them like a supernatural being who are to be feared. However, Achebe counters Conrad's claim in a funny manner. While talking about strange marriage rituals across lands, Oberica mentions the story of a white man and asks Machi if he has ever seen one. And he replies that one passes by here often, and his name is Amadi. And instantly, whoever knew Amadi started laughing as they knew him, and he was not a white man; he was just a leper. Achebe mentions that in the pre-colonial Africa, people suffering from leprosy were politely called the whiteskins. Therefore, with this statement, Achebe builds a common pedestal and draws similarity between the both civilizations' reception of an alien being. Chinua Achebe, in his essay An Image of Africa, writes, and I quote, Heart of Darkness projects the image of Africa as the other world, the antithesis of Europe and therefore a civilization, a place where man's wanted intelligence and refinement are finally mocked by triumphant bestiality. But at the same time, Achebe creates the character, Okonko, who is similar to the beastly character in, in Heart of Darkness, that's Mr. Kurtz. Both men, the most powerful in their respective places, full of vigor, pride, and ambition. Ultimately, the characters grow as parallels who are given shape narratively in a grandiose manner. But both of them die as a result of self-realization of their own folly, therefore erasing the line of otherness, placing the most powerful characters of the respective books, and weighing them equally as two men with very brutal endings, as a product of their own doing, stating that no man is bound by their culture or civilization when it comes to projecting their darker side. This erasing of alterity and creation of similarity is what hints at Achebe's intent of embracing and accepting the anthropological difference and living together in the modern world. Lastly, we see from the two texts, which speak in two different voices about the natives of Africa, and in a similar manner as well. In the Heart of Darkness, Marlowe appeases the intended by lying to her that the last word of Mr. Kurtz was her name. Here, Marlowe tries to keep the brave and saintly stature of Mr. Kurtz alive before the intended. Similarly, in Things Fall Apart, in the last chapter, after the district commissioner orders his chief messenger to take down Okonko's body from the tree, he writes down in his journal about Okonko as he feels that the story might interest the readers and decides to name his book as The Pacification of Primitive Tribes of the Lower Niger. Both the books show the dualistic personality of the characters, the district commissioner and the Marlowe, as both of them decide to tell the stories where they act in a way just to pacify the distress, which comes off as an ironic act, as they fail to see the larger picture. That is to see the very cause of the distress itself. The district commissioner pass, would not have to had to pacify the natives if he wasn't there at the first place. And in case of Mr. Kurtz, he wouldn't have had to die if he wasn't commissioned there with the beastly power over the natives, which arose from their own weakness. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. Our next speaker is K.R. Amruta. Amruta K.R. Are you there?
Yes.
Conceptual analysis of purple hibiscus by Chimamanda Adichie, guest lecturer, St. Mary's College.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. So I'm here to present a paper on the topic conceptual analysis of purple hibiscus.
Amruta, 1 minute, please switch on your video.
Okay, ma'am. So, good evening, everyone. So, I'm here to present a paper on the topic conceptual analysis of purple hibiscus by Chimamanda Adichie. And as a part of introduction, this particular novel is set in post-colonial Nigeria amidst the political instability and economic difficulties. So it is actually narrated in the perspective of a 15-year-old girl whose name is Kamli Achike, who is the member of a wealthy family and dominated by her Catholic father, Eugene, who is also called as Papa throughout the text. And as far as the thematic significance and the conceptual analysis is concerned, the entire text can be categorized into 5 outlooks: domestic, religious, social, and political. So these 4 outlooks give a kind of discursive element, which also gives a perspective of different interpretations to the particular text. And the present paper blends almost all these discursive elements by emphasizing the thematic elements it portrays. So as far as the domestic themes are concerned, the entire text is all about the family. It gives an importance to the family, and it highlights the happenings of a Nigerian wealthy family, which is contrasted with the lower class family life which is portrayed through the text. Now, as far as the gender disparity is concerned, it goes hand in hand with the family structure, because almost all the family members, especially the lady characters, suffers throughout the text because of this gender issues. Now, to give an example, with the dominant character Eugene, who is the father figure of the character, every other characters of the family feels or seems inferior and docile, which shatters the existing serene atmosphere of the text or the family. Okay, so this is portrayed through different kinds of examples. For example, there is a strict punishment which is actually given by the papa to almost all the family members when they fail to get along with the strict values and the faith put upon them as a part of religion. And at the same time, we can see the passivity of female characters are also portrayed through the text, with the portrayal of Cambly, the leading role, and the mother figure Beatrice. At the same time, these characters also becomes the victims of the violent patriarchy and male chauvinism as well. So I can give some examples from the text. That is the passive character Beatrice, who is the mother figure. In spite of the fact that she suffers from a mental trauma, she still goes on with she tries to get along with her husband because she believed that she has to show some gratitude to her husband, as he never marries for the second time in want of a third child. So this is the general condition of the family we can see throughout the text. As far as relationships are concerned, the text portrays wide perspectives of relationships. The entire text is narrated in the perspective of the character Campbell. So as far as Campbell's and her brother Jaja's relationship is concerned, we can see they are always cooperative. At the same time, fathers and the family's relationships are concerned, we can see father, almost all the figure has to endure father and his strict values and beliefs that is imposed upon the family. And at the same time, father never gave any kind of importance accordance to his own father, who hold to himself the Igbo culture and tradition. He believed that his father is pagan just because he holds the beliefs of Igbo culture to himself. And when we take on into consideration the relationship between father and mother, mother seems always docile and inferior because of the patriarchal system which is followed throughout the family by almost all the members. Now, moving to the religious aspect of the text, religion, its faith, and its
I think there is some problem network. Amrita?
Some connection problem. Mine is working fine.
So let me move on to our next speaker, Anisha Kaul. Okay, you have come. Okay, finish your paper. Finish your paper.
Please.
Unmute yourself. Unmute yourself. You are not unmuted.
okay, sorry, ma'am. Okay. Am I audible now?
Yes, it's clear.
Okay.
You speak.
I was talking about the religious aspect of the text. So there is a character named Eugene, who is the papa figure, who brings up some kind of Catholic beliefs and faith into their family, and he imposes all kinds of beliefs and values upon the family, and which is actually imposed as a part of the violence and oppression. And at the same time, the character named Father Benedict represents the white priest. He symbolizes the Western way of life and Western ideology. And in a way, these religious problems are actually portrayed in the family life as well. We can see how Papa inflicted almost all the values and strict beliefs upon the family members. Some of the examples which can be taken from the text are the how the family has to undergo long and tedious prayers before the meal, and how non-Christian people are not allowed in their premises. At the same time, for this reason, Papa also considered his own father, who believes in Igbo culture, as pagan. And Chimamanda Adichie also tried to portray and highlight the Igbo concepts and Igbo aspects in the text in wider perspective. For example, there is a character named Auntie Ifoma and Papa Nuku, who is the grandfather of Campli, and who follows Igbo culture as it is. And we can see grandfather Papa Nuku tries to get along with the Igbo tradition. He attended almost all kinds of Igbo festivals like Muo, where he offers foods to spirits, and where he conducted all kinds of rituals and practices. So this proves that he is always close to his own religion, in spite of the fact that Christianity had already taken up a lot of people's attitude and mind. And at the same time, there is a character called Auntie Ifoma, who brings up the concept of hybridity. She actually followed hybrid culture. She never forget her Igbo culture. At the same time, she tries to get along with the Catholic way of life. For example, while she during her prayers, she mixed up Igbo words with the English words. This proves how she just want to get along with the changing world. At the same time, she never want to give up her old tradition as well. Another character, Father Amadi, go with this hybrid culture. He embraces old culture and the new culture in equal way. So this is all about the religious aspect of the text. Now moving to the social context of the text, the text portrays different types of class families. And Campli belongs to the upper class, and Aunt Ifoma, Papa Nupu, these characters belongs to the lower class. So the text as a whole portrays upper class and lower class of Nigeria as a whole. So we can see it is actually portrayed through their way of life, the tradition they follow, their language they prefer, their cuisines, table manners. These all reflect the kind of culture they put forth. So at the same time, we can see love also plays an important role in the text. The partial part of the text actually deals with the infatuation of Campley towards Father Amari, but this is just portrayed as a romance or the romance fantasy. I mean, that type of portrayal can be seen here. And we can see at the same time this particular relationship had given some kind of strength and a kind of considerable change in the attitude, general attitude of Campley as a female. So she gets her opportunity to be with her culture, and she decided to empower herself only through this relationship. And she tries to find out her sexual identity. She tries to find way for questioning the patriarchy. All these happened only because of this relationship. So through the relationship, through the love affair, even though it was a failure, she tries to find out her own what empowering stance. At the same time, as far as sex and sexuality is concerned, we can see there are characters like Jaja and Campley who was actually forced to deny their sexuality throughout the text. Only by the end of the text, they tries to find out their sexuality and get along with their freedom. Okay, so we have the story of maturation. As far as Jaja, the brother of Campley, is concerned, by the end of the text, we can see that he took up the blame of killing his own father by her mother, and this proves how much he was actually suffering throughout the text.
You need to wind up. You
Okay,
need to
ma'am.
wind up.
Okay. Okay, to conclude, this text is all about some discursive elements, and which is portrayed through the thematic aspect. So it combines all these thematic elements together and portray that it is all about the white presence in Nigeria and its consequences. So it offers a kind of freedom and promise a kind of freedom to almost all the readers through the symbol of purple hibiscus. So that's all with my presentation. Thank you.
Sorry for the interruption. There has been some technical issues. Please go ahead.
Okay, there was some network problem. So Amrita, have you finished?
Ma'am, you asked me to end it. That's why I.
Yes, yes. Okay, you have finished with your session. There was some network problem, so I had to leave.
Okay, ma'am, then.
Okay, so then we move on to our next speaker. Anisha Biswas. Okay. Analysis of urban segregation in Lauren Hansberry's Raising in the Sun with Indian Dalit autobiographical context. She is from Banaras Hindu University.
A post-graduation student.
Okay. She's a PG student from the Banaras Hindu University. Okay. You begin your.
Firstly, I want to thank Rishi Bankim Chandra College for giving me this opportunity to present my paper in this webinar. And the title of my paper is Analysis Urban Residential Segregation in Lawrence Hansberry's Raising in the Sun with Indian Dalit Autobiographical Context. So as there is time constriction, so I just only highlight some points from my paper. The Afro-Americans and the Dalits, the subaltern group in the multicultural country like United States and India, the crisis of identity erects many obstacles to animate their dreams in reality. But when it comes upon the basic needs like residence, education, etc., one of the primary manifestation of identity difference is residential segregation imposed upon them by the elite class. And my paper contemplate on the topic of this urban residential segregation, as I mentioned earlier, and I try to find out some similarities between the play A Raisin in the Sun and with the Dalit autobiographies. And for this paper, I took 4 autobiographies. Two are from Bengal literature by Manoranjan Bapari's ইতিবৃত্তের চণ্ডাল কথা and অদীপ বিশ্বাস দেশভাগের স্মৃতি, and one from Hindi literature, Om Prakash Balmiki's Chutan, and another from Limbal's Akar Machine. So the first thing is all about identity. Everything starts from identity. So there are 3 types of identity, the personal, social, and human. The first identifies means the personal identity identifies an individual as a unique person. The second measure of the individual identity is social identity, where a person belongs to a particular group or structure of relationship. And the third presents a person as a member of a universal human community. These 3 dimensions are juxtaposed with each other and form the all-over identity of a human being. But the dark side of the identity is civilizational differences, which depends on the creation of frontiers and borders in order to distance and protect itself from the emerging threat of the other culture. As Fanon states in his book, Black Skin and White Marks, for Black, identity inferiority creates by the gaze of the white. The person means white who have superior power. It provides them to diminish the existence of black to define them as slaves. And the same thing happened in India. The upper class means Brahmin Kayastha who have authority to reign the society. They oppress the lower class and define them as untouchable and exclude them from all social facilities. So before I talk about a Raisin in the Sun, I want to give a brief description about the Great Migration, which happened in the early decades of 20th century in America, where thousands of Afro-American families influx into south side from north side for their black identity. Mississippi, Chicago become one of the main destination for the black migrants. And the black belt area is moreover a product of large extended ghettos, and despite the apartment size is poor and small, and by restrictive covenants, they would compel to live in that apartment, though the rent in the black belt were higher than their white neighborhood. So the play Raisin in the Sun inevitably altered the social fabric and consciousness of the nation. So the plot of the play was Chicago's South Side, and sometime between World War II and the time between 1959. So in this play, we see black matriarch is in the pivotal point. Lena Younger, the black mama, she get $10,000 insurance check after the death of her husband, and she wants a better house for her family and invest rest of the money for her daughter's education and her son's business. And at the end of the play, we see how they become a victim for their racial appearances. There are many references where we see the urban segregation, how took place in America, and the condition of the black belt areas. We can get from Ruth's dialogue. Thus, I just put one dialogue. This, well, Lord knows we have put enough rent into this here rat trap to pay 4 houses by now. So they consider their home as a rat trap, and at the end of the play, towards the end of the play, we see the white member of Claiborne, Park Welfare Committee. They came to their home, and he came to their home, and said that our Negro families are happier when they live in their own communities. That means Afro Americans has been an essential part for United States society for over 400 years, though they doesn't completely accept as the citizen of America. The same thing we get into the Dalit autobiographies. Caste. In India, one of the complex and rigid social structure whose basic characteristics include complex network of hierarchy, segmentation, and social segregation, or means essential segregation, and the thing of caste discrimination has been practicing from 4,000 years to till date. In Rig Veda, humanity is divided into 4 varnas: Brahmin, Kayastha, Vaishya, and Shudra, and the authority was in the hand of the first 3 varnas. Like the blacks, many lower caste communities have migrated to cities to escape from the caste hegemony, and also partition has played another role in states like West Bengal, Odisha, Punjab, etc., to make disparities in terms of socio-economical power and segregate the Chotolok from the Bhadralok. I took these 2 terms, Chotolok and Bhadralok, from Manoranjan Bapari's book Itibete Chandal Kotha. And thus the lower caste people in caste-based society, they mainly lived outskirts the village, and the upper class reinforced them to live in separate lines from the other caste, as they are untouchables to escape from this hegemonic oppression. Then in cities, they are constraining to settle into urban slum areas or ghettos. Dalit writers like Manoranjan Bapari and Adhir Ghosh, who are refugees from East Bengal and also belong from the lower class. Actually, the influx of refugee kept happening long after the partition. The first 2 groups of migrants, they came in the 2 timeline of the first one is 1946 to 1958, and the second part come 1958 to 58 to 63. They all belong from the middle and upper class families who had not registered themselves officially as displaced person, but the new migrants who were Dalit refugees who entered India between 64 to 71, mainly from the peasantry background of East Pakistan. they are economically burdened on government. And according to these writings, the Bodrolok immigrants who have their economic and social power get their legalized colonies and sanction respectable jobs in their own names. But no colonies was formed for any poor Dalit refugees belong from Namo, Podo, Malo or Muchi group. I took this thing from Itivite Chondal Kotha, and if any rich Dalit refugees wants to buy lands in the middle class colonies, they had to confide upon their false identity. In Hindi Dalit autobiography, Jutan, we see the same thing. Balmiki wrote, he belongs from the community Bankim, hope I pronounce it well, correctly, sorry, who are compelled to live outside a village. A high wall and a pond segregated their big houses in the village from the basti. Saran Kumar Limbal's Akkad Mashi describes that whole Latur town divided into caste lines to explain the residential segregation in the
Anisha,
land.
you need to wind up. You
Ma'am,
need to
I
wind up.
come to in the end.
Okay. Okay.
So he writes the cities are made of hearts of caste. Even localities were identified by caste. So we can see there are many similarities between blacks and the Dalit writings, and one of the major issue is the residential segregation, which reflects in a broad spectrum in their writings. Thank you.
Thank you, Anisha. I now move on to our next speaker. Anisha Kaul. Anisha Kaul.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Her paper is No Return from Johannesburg, an analysis of Pride, the Beloved Country. She is an MA student at the Zamia Millia Islamia University, New Delhi. Let's hear from you.
Good afternoon, all. Am I audible?
Yes, you're audible. You can begin.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here. And with the permission of respected chair, Professor Das, I begin my presentation. I have a presentation to share. Can I start sharing my screen, please?
Yes. Start sharing.
Is my screen visible, ma'am?
Yes, it's visible now.
Yeah, thank you. So the topic of my presentation today is No Return from Johannesburg and Analysis of Pride, the Beloved Country. In the course of next 7 to 8 minutes, we will be covering the following topics. I will be discussing the theme of the presentation, and we will be tracing the journey from Dotchini to Johannesburg and the effect that the said journey causes on the tribe, the family, and the self. We will look into the character of Johannesburg and how in problematic times companionship can bring some respite. And finally, I will conclude my presentation with certain final claims, so to say. To begin with, Johannesburg is portrayed as a rich mineral outpost prominent for gold mining. It witnessed a sudden rise in native migrant population and unfortunately their exploitation as well. Hence, it is essential to revisit the driving forces at work in Johannesburg with special attention to the city itself as a governing force. In this paper, I intend to study the trajectory of major characters in Alan Paton's Cry, the Beloved Country, and highlight the role which Johannesburg plays in their respective journeys. The aim is to promote discussions to relocate the categorically marginalized African literature and culture into the quote-unquote mainstream discourse. The narrative is variably set in Dotchini and Johannesburg, with various characters migrating to the city center. The former is regarded as home, while the latter is certainly not home. It is important to note the direction of the said movement. The chief mobility is witnessed from Dotchini to Johannesburg. An invisible pull seems to uproot these individuals from their habitats and relocate them, or rather dislocate them, to a foreign loci. As a consequence of this movement, at the microcosmic level, the society is affected, and at the microcosmic level, it is the personal bonds which are undone. So, to further this idea, we do need to look into the conception of tribe, family, and the self. Peyton's protagonist, Stephen Kumalo, and his family serve as a site to depict the flux which potentially displays many. John, Gertrude, and Absalom Kumalo migrate never to return home. The reader is informed that Stephen's brother, John, had gone to Johannesburg. Their sister, Gertrude, too, went there in search of her husband. And finally, his son, Absalom, gone in search of his aunt, like other, never returns. No knowledge is disseminated about these drifted souls, and we may conclude that the movement, so to say, is unidirectional. The counter movement of any of these characters is impossible for various reasons. Thus, disassociation and discontent, or disconnect as well, prevails the self, the native self, so to say. Critic Harold R. Collins highlights, I quote, highlights the white effect, so to say, that detribalizes the African society and leads to the, I quote, disorganization of African personalities, unquote. So it is important that we note how this trio is disturbed, and we see that Stephen's quest to Johannesburg must be recognized as an attempt to restore the family, the self, and the tribe at a larger level. These are very interdependent spaces, and these are interconnected aspects of the native life. The city arguably evolves an independent character for itself, which, if not invested with sinister attributes, then at least fosters corruptive forces. It is the unknown, or rather the lesser known realm, suffering, sins, crimes of differing shades freely float in the air. Hence, attempts must be made to trace the spatial politics whereby Johannesburg ceases to be any regular city space. Lauren Kruger mentions that Johannesburg, I quote, has appeared to planners and artists alike to be unimaginable as well as unmanageable, unquote. Johannesburg, moreover, it facilitates an alteration of sensibilities in the characters and plays a vital role in their expeditions as well. And such is the case in Stephen, the protagonist's journey, wherein we see a kind of self-realization, a self-recognition is achieved at the end of the journey. And moreover, there is no escape from this being initiated into this journey. As I quote, all roads lead to Johannesburg, and if you are white or if you are black, they lead to Johannesburg, unquote. Thus, in order to survive, some or the other source of respite or companionship must be sought. And it is in the character of Theophilus Masimagu and Mrs. Lithibe that Stephen seeks these respites. They prove to be a blessing in disguise for Stephen, and in their companionship, Stephen progresses in his journey. To reconsider his journey without these characters is impossible. Isolated and homeless, Stephen too would have perished in Johannesburg. Further, Stephen Kumalo and James Jarvis, the two unhappy fathers, also seek solace in friendship and forgiveness. Dowie thus regards that the narrative is quintessentially, I quote, tale of two fathers, each of whom loses a son, unquote. For one man's son has killed the other man's son. So, my final submission, so to say, in this presentation would be, or articulated through this presentation, would be that Stephen Kumalo's journey is to reclaim consciously, unconsciously, all that he can and return home safely. Life and Dot Shiny have suffered immensely. I quote, the tribe was broken, the house broken, and the man broken, unquote. Stephen must nourish and refurbish all that he can with love and compassion and kindness. However, this act of reclaiming cannot be materialized for all, as none of the corrupted selves like John, Gertrude, Absalom, and many other unnamed, unrecognized characters, they can never attempt to cross the threshold and be reclaimed. Stephen can only return home with the relatively innocent, quote-unquote, selves, his nephew, his newly married daughter-in-law, and the unborn grandchild. The rest, I submit, are claimed by Johannesburg. So that brings us to the end of my presentation. And these are some of the references which I have used in my original paper and this presentation. You might have a look at them. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, Anisha. Our next speaker is Anjumara Hussain. Anjumara Hussain.
Ma'am, I think she won't attend because she is injured.
Okay. Then we move on to our next speaker, Chayanika Moitro. She will be speaking on a brief analysis of African literature, orature, and culture. She is a postgraduate student in the Department of English, Rishi Bankim Chandra College. Chayanika, you can begin.
Good afternoon, ma'am.
Yes. Good afternoon. Begin your speech.
Yes, ma'am. I would like to thank the organizers of this webinar to allow me and giving me this opportunity to present this paper titled "A Brief Analysis of African Literature, Orature, and Culture." I would like to begin it with a few informations about Africa. Africa is the largest continent, second largest continent, as we all have known it, and the word Africa comes from the Latin word Africa. It means sunny. Inhabitation of this continent is very primitive, and it has been called the dark continent of the world. Mungo Park, David Livingstone, Morton Stanley are few names who have contributed positively to explore this continent. This continent is remarkable for its 4 o'clock showers, and it has some rich minerals and jewel mines. So let's we move to the literature of Africa. The development of African literature has designed by 5 different stages. First stage is determined through the oral culture of Africa. Storytelling is one of the major oral tradition in African culture. It spreads knowledge from generation to generation. Storytellers had a respected state in the society, and male storytellers are called as griots. They are praise singers, historians, and musical entertainers. Their purpose is to guide human and social morals with installation of lesson or value to transmit wisdom to children. These storytellers use not only words but also gestures, singing, facial expressions, body movements, and acting as tools to make the story interesting and memorable. They have played various musical instruments to make the storytelling interesting and memorable. One of them is called kora, and in the there is a picture of this instrument kora, as you have seen on the right hand side. Then another instrument is also available that time, is called balafon. Both are string like instruments. Now these are actually poetic narratives, and through this they spread knowledge from one generation to another generation. Sabi is a long narrative form, reveal the nature of relationship between men and women in this African oral tradition. Female storytellers of this African culture are called kritis. Through these songs, they express their independence, self-reliance, and encouragement, as well as empowerment to other women. Next, we move to the second phase of the development, that is that was determined through the publication of the first literary text by an African writer called Juan Latino. It was published in 1573. The first known writers of African origins are former slaves who have been carried off in majority to America and Europe. Among them, notable are Guilhem Moses, who was also known as Anton Wilhelm Amo. He writes 3 philosophical and medical treatises in Latin. Another one is Phyllis Whitley. She has been known after her American owner. She is the first known poet with African origin. Her poems consists of elegies, religious and moralizing lyric monologues. She has been a bestseller author during that period. The interesting narrative of the life and adventures of Oluda Ikwano or Gustavo Vasa the African, published in 1789, was written by Olaudah Ikwan, and a remarkable genre of literature has also emerged during this period, is called Onitsha market literature. Pioneers of this Onitsha market literature are Michael D. Anang, Raphael Amoroto of Ghana, Dennis Osadebe of Nigeria, and Edwin Barclay. It embraces a fascination with westernized urban life, and it has the desire to warn the newly arrived Western culture, and as well as it resonates against the corruption and dangers that accompany this new culture. Typical titles of this text that Onitsha market literary tradition has exhibited are Rose Only Loved My Money, Drunkards Believe Bar as Heaven, Why Some Rich Men Have No Trust in Some Girls, and How to Get a Lady in Love. These are so cheap because the semi-literate people, students, taxi drivers are mainly the author or writer of these pamphlets or texts. Let's move to the third phase of this development. It has been inaugurated through the publication in 1946 of the first of African's international poetry anthology in French language. It has been accompanied with the creation in 1947 of the journal Presence African and the establishment of the publishing house Presence African in 1949. It is the aftermath of the founding of the philosophical literary trend of the negritude. Black Orpheus is a journal that was founded in 1957 and is a very important literary journal during this period. Let's move to the fourth stage, and it begins in the year 1960 with the proclaimed declaration over the final and complete elimination of the colonialism. Africa has been gifted with extraordinary merits during this period. Chinua Achebe is one of them. His full name is Albert Chinualumagu Achebe, and he is a genuine talent. He is most notable in the field of post-colonial study for the depiction of social and psychological disorientation through the imposition of Western customs upon the traditional African society. Things Fall Apart, written in 1958, is a reliable document on post-colonial study. It vividly depicts the tribal life and intrusion of Western imperialism, and it has been considered by many as his magnum opus. Another work by Achebe is Arrow of God, published in 1964. It's more mature novel than the previous one.
Tamalika, you wind up. Wind up. You're running short of time. You're running short of time. You wind up your paper.
Sorry? Hello?
You finish it off soon. Okay, you are running short of time.
Okay, ma'am. Okay, ma'am. I will. It depicts the African world that is completely foreign to the global reading public, but his sympathetic treatment and intelligent style make the way easier for the readers to stroll in that world. His other plays are No Longer at Ease and A Man of the People. Another writer was Ngugi Thiongo. He was firmly believed that the history of Commonwealth Africa has been turned by the Mau Mau rebellion. His first two novels are Weep Not Child and The River Between. A Grain of Wheat is considered as his magnum opus. The central character Mungo here celebrates the independence of Kenya, and here he and the depiction of this character is most crucial. Wole Soyinka is another African writer. He has won the Nobel Prize as the first Black African writer for literature in 1986. A Dance of the Forests in 1964 was written for the celebration of Nigerian independence. This play has lucidity and fantasy of a dream, direct association of past and present between human beings and spirits, as well as God's deserts mentions. Corruption, treachery of modern life, and hollowness of moral values are hinted in a very provocative and interesting way. His other works are The Lion and the Jewel and The Road. Soyinka argues to exploit English language to express the complex African experience. Let's move to the feminist writers during this period. Buchi Emechita, her best known works are The Bride Price, The Slave Girl, The Joys of Motherhood, Teach the Cat, Know Where to Play, The Destination Bifera, Double Yoke, and Kehinde. Another feminist writer during this period is Misra Gatumugo. The Long Illness of Ex-Chief Kithi is a play written by her, and Daughter of My People Sing is another significant work by her. The reviewer of world literature today, Tanur Ogede, observes Mugo as a poet who with a mission in her society which embraces the black race, the underprivileged class, and her specific female gender. Let's move to the fifth stage of this development. It has been marked during the early 1990s, and it starts in the decisive political and social meeting in Benin called Conference Nationally, and it continues till that. And so the representation is very crucial during to establish any view about a society, and West represents Africa as a docile and vulnerable, but Native African writers resist against it. Peter Young comments that African literature is a literature that did not simply arise from the British literary tradition. Thus, thanking you for your attention, everyone. I have concluded now. Thank you.
Thank you, Chayanika. So till now we have completed with some of our speakers. So if you have any questions and suggestions, I ask you till now, then we can move on to the next set of speakers. Please, if any of you have any questions to any of our speakers who have already spoken. Okay, so should I move on to our next group of speakers? Srijoy, should I move to the next group of speakers? Hello, Srijoy, are you there?
Yes, ma'am, I'm there. Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Please move on to the next group of speakers.
Okay. So our next speaker is Debalika Pal.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, her paper will be The Evolution of African Orature and in Resistance. She is a fourth sem student of MA in Rishi Chandra College. Begin, Debalika.
Yes, ma'am. Ma'am, is my screen visible?
Yes, we can see.
Okay.
It's okay.
Good evening to my respected professor and the other fellow participants present over here. The title of my paper is The Evolution of African Orature and Its Resistance. First, I would like to give a brief introduction about orature. So the term orature, coined by P.O. Zirimu, an Uganda linguist, is a portmanteau term denoting imaginative works of oral tradition that is usually referred to as oral literature. The World Oral Literature Project website points out that Zirimu has coined this term in order to avoid the oxymoron of oral literature. Ngugi wa Thiongo, in his book Global Ethics for Theory and the Politics of Knowing, elaborating on this problematic nature of this oxymoron, states that the problem lies in the English language, referring to the Eurocentric notion of the equation between orality and illiteracy. Orature or oral literature is often termed to as traditional literature, folk literature or folklore, which are often sung or recited by birds or griots, that is, West African praise singers, poets and musicians. This constitutes roughly of stories, songs, poetry, proverbs, riddles, tongue twisters, manners, customs, superstitions, ballads, etc. Now, African orators are rich and varied in their form and content, developing since the beginning of African culture. It still remains living tradition that continues to evolve and flourish even today. This folklore is a representation of the culture and tradition of the community. It is believed that it has the power to unite the ancestors, the living, and those who are not yet born. Dorothy Noy states that, I'm quoting her, folklore is a part of culture that makes cultural practices of modern societies in connection to its past. The folkloric form in a way of communication among generations. Oral narratives help to affirm and validate spiritual realities and experiences. The folk tales are much like the Western fables, which tells a story with the moral and have animals for characters. But unlike fables, the moral lessons in the stories are present throughout and not just set apart at the end. Some of the most common themes portrayed within the stories are honesty, loyalty, and greed. Few of the morals overlap with the American tales, while some differs because of the different cultural values and different characterizations of the society. The use of the nature is very prominent in this narrative. Animals mostly play the major roles, and lessons learned by them act as a teaching for the readers and audience. James Fernandez suggested that it is difficult to know that how people understand their identity as human beings, were it not for, I'm quoting James Fernandez, the other animals that serve so conveniently and appropriately as a freedom for own activity and reflectivity. So, when people tell stories about animals, they usually talk about themselves and about the animal-human relationship. Using this parallel thinking, people discuss each other indirectly. Colonialism and imperialism gave rise to the own folklores of the African native peoples, which extracted knowledge from the colonized community and reformed it for the global consumption. However, the folklorist ways of colonized Africa and the colonized ways worked antagonistically, forming a binary power relationship between the colonizer and the colonized, where the folklore acted as a social cultural form of counterpower for the marginalized groups. Thus, folklore performs a dynamic multi-dimensional role for the access of the community resources. The resistance power of folklore in the post-colonial context was systematically engaging concepts of cultural bonds, social relationships, and practices, including local legends and beliefs. The folklore of resistance changes according to the culture and ethnic position of the colonizer, along with the political, ethical, and geographical circumstances of the colonized people. The effect of colonization falls upon the emotional well-being of the colonial community, along with the self-identity and the relationship of the colonized people. Moreover, the education system during colonization had a hegemonic influence that functions in the removal of the beliefs and cultural practices of the colonized people through a force of assimilation. Antonio Gramsci states that, I'm quoting him, every relationship of hegemony is necessarily an educational relationship and occurs not only within a nation between the various forces of which the nation is composed, but in the international and worldwide field between complexes and national and continental civilizations. This hegemonic relationship that occurs within the colonial practices are embedded socially and practically. But through the practice of this folklore, the colonized and marginalized communities can access the historical knowledge of their culture and tradition, which assisted them to counter the detrimental forces of the colonial assimilation. Albert Wonnet, in his essay Towards New Oceania, analyzes the relationship of the colonization and the education and writes that devoting to civilizing us, to cutting us away from the roots of our culture, from what this colonizer viewed as darkness, superstition, barbarism, and savagery. For instance, the missionary school under colonization was structured strategically to emphasize on the Western language and literature, diminishing the indigenous narratives and epistemology. This educational strategy was dedicated to eradicate and discredit the native language system, which Ngugi wa Thiongo calls as the cultural bomb in his book, Decolonizing the Mind, The Politics of Language in African Literature, but where the term bomb suggested complete eradication. He proposes that the colonizers attempted to annihilate a people's belief in their names, in their language, in their environment, and in their heritage of struggle, in their unity, in their capacity, and ultimately in themselves as mental colonization. Fanon, in his book, The Wretched of the Earth, Colonial War and Mental Disorders, also talks about the mental health problem faced by the people due to the annihilation of their beliefs and community system. This also creates a sense of false identity and self. For example, in several post-colonial narratives, the colonizers forces the colonized people to see their past as one wasteland of non-achievements and makes them want to distance themselves from that wasteland. To fight against this educational hegemony of the colonization, the natives often incorporated and re-establish their cultural practices to resist against the cultural power, which Said calls as the consolidated Western scholastic system. Anand Prahlad, in his essay Africana Folklore, History and Challenges, points out about the politics of identity in Joel Chandler's Harris' Uncle Remus, and that the unsettling mystery of Black identity, along with the racist representation of Black people presented with a fairly accurate example of African proverbs and tales. The Harlem Renaissance played a major role in this act of resistance. The Harlem Renaissance was an intellectual, social, and cultural phenomena against the oppressive trajectory of slavery, the segregation law, and the social injustice. The revolution manifested itself through literature, visual arts, music, theater, and social activities embodied within the Black community. Scholars and critics believed that the Black people produced their own art to free themselves from the African force of the central power. Zora Hurston, a novelist, folklorist, activist, played a major role in the production of African narratives in relation to Afro-American political and literary discourse. She incorporated African folklore in her writing as a means of resistance. Even though Hurston employs boundary of genre while writing within the folklore and centering on the African Americanness, portraying her characters into the way America likes to see the Negro life. But she had beautifully captured the psychological moment of the Negro mind while focusing on the folktales. Just like the form of the African folktales, Hurston too employs nature as a motive. In her novel Moses, the Man of the Mountain, she portrayed nature being overshadowed by the tyranny of the Pharaoh, who actually represents the state power. The Pharaoh didn't allow the Hebrew people to live peacefully. The Hebrew people were removed for their natural state of being. Again, in her another novel, Their Eyes Were Watching God, the character Jamie represents empowerment and self-identity perceived through nature. During the pre-colonial African society, there were structural and formal system of education. The children used to learn by carefully imitating their adults and parents. The social cultural values and attitudes that the African children needed to learn were embedded into their folklore itself. Warman states that, I'm quoting him, oral literature has remained extant in our modern literary genre, especially as it provides the essential and salient communal fiber of the modern story in its aesthetic cognitive tendencies, epistles, and ideological direction. Literary texts now adapt and modify oral tradition in order to communicate to a wider and greater number of people because of the vital, productive, and current exigencies that the society is faced with. Even though colonialism tried to eradicate the African origin through the means of Christianization and missionary education, still the native people stuck to their roots and renovated their folklore according to the circumstances. The themes that the folklore dealt with brought out the experience of their marginalization and suggested ways of resistance against the hierarchy and to survive against it. Not only did it state the experience, but also provided knowledge about their tradition and practices that were tried to eradicate. One such example of a folklore that emerged during the period of colonization in Africa is Nagwana Malundi narrative of the Sukuma people who lived on the southern side of the Lake Victoria in northwestern Tanzania. Nagwana Malundi is considered to be a historical as well as a cult figure. He is portrayed to have many heroic achievements like defeating the Maasai cattle raiders and outwitting the colonialists while he was imprisoned by them. He is said to have magical powers also. This kind of portrayal of the heroes of folklore provided the natives with beliefs and motivation to rise against the struggle. To conclude my paper, Orature is a medium to explore cultural identities along with the cultural practices of the communities. In diasporic studies, oral literature acts as an agent of preservation, resurrection, and through it, the history of the tradition can be traced. This literature that acts as a mode of resistance plays a vital role to mobilize the oppressed people and strive for their liberation and the colonization. This kind of literature presents the willpower of the people and reflects their imperial plans to break through the political discourse. Thank you.
Thank you, Devalika. Our next speaker is Deepayan Dotto. Okay. He will be speaking on documenting the trauma of apartheid through investigative journalism, reading Camp Select Nonfiction. He is the Assistant Professor of English, THK Jain College, Kolkata.
Thank you so much. Am I audible?
Yes.
Good evening, everyone, and I thank the organizers for giving me this opportunity, and also Madam in Chair, Professor Tamalika Dash. So, without wasting any more time, because the time is very short, I'll just begin with my paper. My paper is titled "Documenting the Trauma of Apartheid Through Investigative Journalism: Reading Kanthemba Select Nonfiction." The period of apartheid in South Africa was most turbulent, and for the black population, certainly the most devastating. And any literary text, be it fiction or non-fiction, that emanates out of this period, if we attempt a subtextual reading of these texts, we can trace both individual and collective trauma of black population. So for this paper, I have selected some non-fiction journalistic writings of the short story writer and investigative journalist Kanthemba, who worked in Drum magazine. All these were first published in the Drum magazine. And towards the end of the paper, I also try to problematize Themba's position as an investigative journalist and question if Themba's body of works, journalistic works published in the Drum magazine, can be classified as black testimonial. So without wasting any more time, I'll just start to read my paper. The South African general elections of 1948 was one of the most significant milestones in the country's history of racial segregation. It was when the Afrikaner National Party rose to power with a strong majority, riding the slogan of apartheid, calling for a separation of South Africa's white minority from its non-white majority, and separating the non-whites and black population along tribal lines to limit their political powers or opportunities of dissent. With the enactment of these apartheid laws, racial discrimination was now institutionalized and enforced through the systems of surveillance and employment of police forces who routinely used violence against the non-European population of South Africa. The Drum magazine was started in 1951 amidst this apartheid South Africa by Robert Christ for representing the tribal population expecting black readership. It soon changed course when Jim Bailey took over, moved its headquarters to Johannesburg, and appointed Anthony Sampson as the editor. Drum started highlighting the more vibrant urban culture. They also formed an editorial board with some of the leading political and cultural personalities of the time, like Joe Rathibe, Alfred Zuma, Andy Anderson, and Henry Nzumalo, who ensured that the magazine reflected urban black life. They were joined also by a group of black journalists and photographers who had no other educational facilities owing to the contemporary oppression. For them, Drum became a platform to practice their craft, develop their skills, and showcase their talents. The offices of Drum, free from segregation, also provided temporary relief from the world of harsh discrimination outside. The magazine published its first major investigation, Beetle Today, in March 1952. After Henry Nzumalo, dressed up in tattered clothes, posed as a farm laborer in Beetle and exposed the miserable slave-like working conditions, repeated beatings, and deaths of the black laborers in the potato farm. Direct political involvement was not the primary intention of the Black magazine, but the editorial board felt that it was perhaps the need of the time, with protests and resistance against the apartheid demanding representation and documentation. Following Beetle Today, numerous reports of racial violence was published in the Drum, covering significant political events like the Defiance Campaign of 1952, the Sophiatown forced removals, the treason trials, and the Sharpeville massacre. This was a period of mass migration of population in the cities, with thousands coming into the urban communities due to economic necessities and labor laws. They had the enthusiasm to participate in this black urban cultural life. This was also the period after the Second World War, with ideas of social justice, democracy, nationalism spreading through the world, although as Western ideals. New black urban population adapted these ideals, which helped the rise of serious black writers and journalists and an upsurge of creating writing by them. Kanthemba joined the Drum magazine as a staff after winning a Drum writing competition in 1953. He was mainly publishing his short stories. And he was mainly publishing his short stories in the magazine, but towards the end of that decade, he had to assume the role of an investigative journalist. The reports of his investigation was published as essays or opinion pieces in the Drum. The world of Cantimba was Sophiatown, Johannesburg. The glamour and the vulgarity, the jazz, the urban slums, the shebeen culture, and the ever-prevalent Tutsi threat in the neighborhood. His writing recorded and created the voices, the images, the values of the community. His easy-flowing, witty literary style, punctuated with satire and sharp critique of the regressive cultural hegemony of apartheid, recorded black suffering under the system. Themba wrote out of a social necessity. These reports, essays, or opinion pieces published in the Drum, which are in style like his stories, explore in shocking details the state-sponsored oppression, exploitation, poverty, and racial violence. The grand project of apartheid was the normalization of the system through ideology, institutionalized violence, and sheer repetition of the dominant discourse. For the black population of the country, this suggests a high exposure to traumatic events. Themba's accounts record this individual or collective traumatic experiences or post-traumatic symptoms of the black people in Sophiatown. Next, I have discussed a bit in detail about the development of trauma theory and how it applies to literature, starting theory of unrepresentability of trauma, where in this essay by Freud, Beyond the Pleasure Principle, and also in his book, From Studies in Hysteria, he actually defined trauma as a disruptive experience that is unrepresentable. But I have moved on later, following Kathy Caruth and to later scholarships, like books from Rothberg, like Traumatic Realism, The Demands of Holocaust Representation, or Worlds of Hurt, Literatures of Trauma by Kali Tal, and argued that these later scholarship actually tries to move beyond the paradigm of Freud and Kathy Caruth, and they examined literary trauma in cultural context, both individually and collectively. So, like in post-colonial writings, Trauma Out of Bounds, Steph Krabs argued that this paradigm of trauma studies needs to go out of Europe and record post-colonial trauma and studies on apartheid. So this later scholarship is what I have used to read Cantemba's select nonfiction. Starting with some of the few instances of Cantemba's nonfiction, all of which were originally published in the Drum. I started with Terror in the Trains, which was Themba's reports on the violence in Dubai. It was published in Drum in October 1957. It portrays how a public service like railways had become a terror for the black population in Johannesburg. The few third-class coaches and all too few trains, as Themba suggests, it suggests the deprivation of the black under apartheid. But here he discusses the main threat that comes from the Tutsis, who threatened the passengers with violence and very often robbed them. And in this essay, Themba also discusses the violence that erupted between the two communities, the Zulu and the Basotho. And I have discussed that about this violence, that the situation this aggravated due to the policy of ethnic grouping, which was one of the important tenets of apartheid, which sought along tribal lines. Now, this inter-ethnic violence was a direct result of the trauma caused by the apartheid. And in both the Tutsi incident, how the Tutsis dehumanized the people whom they robbed, and also in this violent clashes between the tribes, we see how traumatized subjects turning from victim to the victimizer to cope with trauma. Next, I've discussed the two essays, The Boozers Beware of Barberton and Let the People Drink. Both of deals with the shebeen life, and Themba has often been called the shebeen intellectual because he was a heavy drinker and also saw this shebeen life as a resistance to this apartheid, as a resistance or a defiance to this apartheid laws and the prohibition on drinking. Now, in Boozers Beware of Barberton, he of course deals with homemade liquor and how he discusses how on consumption of this homemade liquor, people started showing this psychotic behavior. And in this report, he writes that there is a Shibin yard where the people have gone mysteriously mad. And he actually discusses some of the citizens about the madness and psychotic behaviors of some of the citizens who lived near the Shibin. He concludes that this is because of the Shibin who sold a homemade drink, which gave a quick kick, and in exchange, people became mad and started to show psychotic behavior. Another
you have to wind up, okay?
Sure. There is also another essay called The Nude Pass Parade, and here he discusses the humiliation and public shaming which were often used by the hegemony to break down the spirits of revolution and resistance. And this is, he says, naked, humiliated, hoping for the God's time to pass away. He reiterates the inescapability of the process, and one could be anything: dignified businessman, top-class lawyer, jeweler, or anything. One could be just black and still asked to enter a room for this pass and asked to drop down their trousers. And this is the traumatic experience he shares. And also, there is also another essay that I was trying to inculcate. This is political prisoners banned to the concentration camps. This was a rather sensational title that he gave, but actually it was not a concentration camp. And this report actually had worldwide audience, because it obviously brought the memories of Nazi concentration camp, because this was just after the Second World War. Now, these are some of the essays that I have discussed in my paper, and try to show how these traumatic experiences are documented by Themba. In the part of the conclusion, I have argued that Themba, the creative writer, and Themba, the investigative journalist, actually comes together in these works. These texts are non-fiction, but these texts resist strict categorization. And Themba himself was an urban black South African, so he belonged to the cultural group that he was reporting on. And he was also at the receiving end of this oppression and the racial violence this group was subjected to. So Themba's designation as an investigative journalist can be problematized. It can be argued that his efforts to uncover, document, and inform the readers about the situation of black South Africans under apartheid was not simply journalistic endeavor. Instead, there were also efforts to unite and mobilize resistance against this system, with first-person narrative socially significant experiences, like in Brothers in Christ, where he goes to the churches and he is thrown out of all the churches, and multiple narrative voices as protagonists, as well as Themba himself, which represented the community that lived through similar situations. There are possibilities of categorizing Themba's non-fiction works that were published in the Drums at Black Testimonial. Thank you.
Thank you, Dipayan. Next speaker is Dharmi Pegu.
Am I audible, ma'am?
Yes. She will be presenting a paper on construction of orature in the trilogy novels of Chinua Achebe and Ben Okri, reinterpretation of Afro-diaspora. Okay, begin your paper.
Is my PPT visible? Is my PowerPoint visible?
No, we can't see your PowerPoint still now.
No, PowerPoint is not visible.
Is it visible now?
Yes, now it's starting. Yes, now it's visible.
Good evening, Chairperson ma'am and my fellow participants. The title of my paper is Construction of Orature in the Trilogy Novels of Chinua Achebe and Ben Okri, Reinterpretation of Afro-Diaspora. I will directly come to the discussion. My discussions will be, and the objective of my paper is to analyze the elements of orature in both the African writers' trilogy novels, that is Chinua Achebe's African trilogy, Things Fall Apart, No Longer at Ease,
Row of God, and Ben Okri's trilogy, The Famished Road, Songs of Enchantment, Infinite Riches. Second, to review the origin of its traditional literary works and the major readings of the trilogy novels in the light of the concepts associated with oral tradition, belief, realism, and culture, marked by the overall indeterminacy that captures a society caught between its traditional roots and the demands of a rapidly changing world. To highlight the strategies of constructive narratives revealing in-depthness to the indigenous tradition of folk tales in both the trilogy novels through its paradoxical celebration of orature in the text. To explore the evolution of African writers, rise of African novels consisting of oral literature and culture and its relevance with the modern African literature from the era of Chinua Achebe to the present era of Ben Okri. Chinua Achebe's trilogy novels portrays the traditions and culture of the Igbo people, where he tries to employ his own literary style to make his work appealing to readers. He resorts to oral literature, culture derived from the Igbo ethnic group, to depict the Igbo tradition and culture to the non-initiates. Achebe's trilogy novels portrays the issue of gender, race, ethnicity, tradition, invasion, pacification, and social pattern of Igbo people in Nigeria. He is the writer who opened the major casements of African fiction and considered the father of modern African literature. Achebe may have the universal application of themes in his novels to study his native people, yet the Igbo experience has parallels in native cultures around the world, which makes the study socially important as it deals with the problems which are universal. In Achebe's novels, the reader explores a few decades of Nigerian history where colonization brings an alien culture that led to the destruction and death of the native culture and paved the way for the regeneration of a new one. The theme of pacification, invasion, and disruption gives the firm impression of Nigerian novels. Chinua Achebe established the Nigerian tradition in his novels to express national culture. This tradition takes its roots from the Nigerian folk culture and creatively makes use of the native proverbs, legends, folk tales, and local myths by capitalizing the indigeneity of both Nigeria and African literature. Through these novels, Achebe deconstructs the Western colonial discourse and reconstructs the history of Africa by depicting total rehabilitation of the image and dignity of the African personality, bruised and damaged by the colonial master. He eventually projects the true African experience and new image of Africa to the world, creating a global appeal reaching far beyond the periphery of Africa. Achebe accomplished his success by using the same language, that is English, as a tool which was once used by the colonizers as means of control. Drenched in traditional African folklore, Okri's Abiku novels offer a mixed message on the question of purity and the quest for taproots and homogeneity. For a constant pursuit to exchange ideas, experience, and material culture in the best tradition of an avowed cosmopolitan, the writer depicts a Yoruba intellectual climate which was and still is largely characterized by a dialogic ethos. The most obvious disparate elements and divergent practices are made to interact in small village, which becomes the scene of multifarious cultural traffic and the amphitheater. Ben Okri have depicted a quest for a more hopeful future where edges blur between tradition and change, science and myth, old and new, and even between the human and the spirit world to create an open-ended post-colonial discourse. He initiates a reconceptualization of his creative practice that redirects him back to his African heritage, where a Yoruba resource base forms a kernel of this process. His contact with other epistemologies makes his work decidedly hybridic in nature. The comprehensive fields of postcolonial studies, diasporic criticism, and anthropological studies situates Ben Okri's literary oeuvre within a globalized African consciousness that embraces all humanity. The nature of the trilogy characters, time, space, and the tissue of plot suggests fields of possibilities beyond magic and realism that connects the readers to engage in challenges of incompatible logics of capitalist and pre-capitalist societies which, however conflicting, never fall into an assumed or imposed hierarchy. The possibility of a new definition of culture is being opened up by such a discourse, which does not need to choose between concentrated or the versions of metropolitan forms and representations of essentialist alternatives. In the novel, Things Fall Apart, hybridity is expressed through the hybrid language patterns and by mixing the oral language of Africa with the written language forms of English. It is a hybrid novel that explores the hybrid forms constructed by Achebe based on postcolonial theories of Homi Bhabha and Mikhail Bakhtin. It carries the double consciousness of its characters, aiming to show the real-life experience of the Igbo people in the pre- and post-colonial era in Africa. Achebe in his African trilogy shows hybridity as a dynamic process which occurs in every cultural context. The more cultures interact with each other, the more new hybrid culture takes place, and thus new language varieties and styles will be produced. This means that hybridity can be not only appear under the colonial encounters, but it can also appear in any kind of cultural context. In this sense, hybridity is represented by Chinua Achebe to show the effects of colonialism in one hand and to exploit these effects to challenge and reject the colonization in the other hand. I conclude myself, drawing on the traditional Igbo tales of Achebe's youth, the African trilogy is a literary landmark, a mythic and universal tale of a modern Africa. As Toni Morrison wrote, African literature is incomplete and unthinkable without the works of Chinua Achebe. Once Ben Okri, on late Chinua Achebe, said he was a man who answered the questions of his times, the times in which he found himself in tough, brief, elegant novels, and in doing that actually helped to create a language of literature in which many of us came to write in afterwards. So in a way, he is the sweeper of the road ahead. He was one of the three great writers that claimed the road ahead so that succeeding generations could travel along it. Chinua Achebe adopted the hybrid narrative in the African Igbo portrayal as a reflection of their real life. Moreover, he shows the changes that the colonizers have brought into the Igbo's community in this matter through these hybrid forms. Chinua Achebe changed the European negative views on American people as being primitive and savage. Okri, through his novels, replaces nationalist politics with a more local allegiance to people and to places, their cultures, histories, and their predicaments in the face of larger social and political issues, where he laid emphasis on the resultant transformation of the individual self and action in the novels. Hence, Ben Okri expounded a certain kind of humanism depicting a synergetic association of the individual and the collective in the context of post-colonial societies through the portrayal of the interpersonal relationships in the novels. Hence, Ben Okri's Abiko trilogy explores the function of hybridity, showing the destabilization of such spaces as the real and the imaginary, the new and the old, and the self and the other. A third space emerges where irreconcilable perspectives and contradictory properties coexist, although problematically. Thank you.
Thank you, Dharmi. Dharmi is the alumnus of Dibrugarh University, Department of English. Okay, next speaker is Srijoy Vishwas. He will be speaking on Unhooding the Mothers, Emechata Asking for Reimbursement. He is a student of MA in the English department in Rishi Bankim Chandra College.
Thank you, ma'am.
Srijoy, begin with...
Ma'am?
Yes?
Ma'am, is my presentation visible?
Yes, it's coming. The window has come, but nothing is showing here.
Is it visible now?
Yes, yes, yes. Now it's okay. You begin.
Wait a minute. Yeah. So I'll be speaking on Unhooding the Mothers, Imechita Asking for Reimbursement. You can see from the cover picture that I have given a picture of a modern mother holding her child. So you may ask that why a mid-20th century the author is being represented in such a modern picture, because Imechita was much ahead of her time. He long ago predicted how to unhood the mothers from all the cultural and the social ostracization. Let's see what measures Imechita takes to aware and unhood the mothers. Introduction. So, women have always been hooded by mothering. So women have always been hooded by mothering. That women have to be mother, right? If you no matter what you are doing, either you are a professional or you are working, you have to be a mother. Imechita imbibes this theory in two of her texts, The Joys of Motherhood and The Bride Price. In these two texts, Imechita addresses the issue of motherhood in such a way that he unknowingly becomes the author of the world. Let us see how it happens. So let us have a brief summary of the joys of motherhood. Ngugi is the daughter of Ona and Agawati. After a few days, Ona dies. Then she gets married to Adanko. So unable to bear children, Adanko divorces her. Then she is forced to leave her village Ibuza and go to Lagos. You can see the problem here. She is unable to be a mother. That's why she is forced to leave the village. Then she gets married to Nafi. Then she gets married to Nafi, the man whom she dislikes. Then her chi, her personal god, answers her question, and she becomes mother of many babies. She conceives many babies. Then what happens? Nafi marries her elder sister's elder brother's wife Adaku. So after marrying Adaku, life becomes very tough for her because they were not financially well off. So what happens that Adaku leaves. Here Ngugi does not leave. Adaku leaves Ngugi and Nafi and moves out for the betterment of her daughter. Finally, Ngugi dies, unattended by any of her children. The motherhood for whom Ngugi sacrificed all her life, she dies unattended by the children. Finally, her mother doesn't procure any fruit. So the next story which I will be taking is The Bride Price. What happens in that Akunna and her brother leaves, Akunna's father dies. Then for that reason, she has to leave the city of Lagos and move to Ibuza. Here the movement is from Lagos to Ibuza. In the earlier story, it was from Ibuza to Lagos. They return back to their mother's village Ibuza. Ma Blackie, their mother, marries to their uncle Okonko according to the African custom. Then Akunna falls in love with Chike, the schoolmaster. But their love remains unsanctioned as Okonko does not approve that. Then what happens that Okoboshi, who was the school student of Akunna, kidnaps her. But somehow she manages to run with Chike to an urban city again, but finally she dies during her childhood. So the issues which I will be pointing by keeping in mind these two stories are: the first issue is that the first issue is that female circumcision. The female circumcision is FGM. It is also known as FGM, female genital mutilation, but the clitoral hood is cut to quench the desire of female. So it was mainly practiced in Africa, Asia, and Middle East. Though Imechita in this novel does not, like these other works, in this novel he does not addresses the issue of circumcision physically, but he does that emotionally. You can see that Ngugi has to marry Nafi, whom he does not like, and he has to leave the Lagos. Akunna faced number of hurdles before marrying her beloved Chike, and Ona, who was Ngugi's father, Ona, who was Ngugi's mother, has to give up her desires because her father said that she is being sacrificed to the river goddess. So Ona, Ngugi, and Akunna, three of them has to quench their desire due to patriarchal stronghold and iron fist. So transition. But when they eventually become mothers, they undergo a very distressive transition, that is from extensive to intensive motherhood. What happens is that in the African tradition and African society, the motherhood was extensive. As the society was polygamous, there were many people, wives of the husband to look who used to look after a child. But when they moved to the colonized city of Lagos, the family was nuclear. So each of them had to maintain a large family. And the economy was not agrarian. It was highly Western, it was Western capitalist. So the income was very much less, and and all the mothers had to manage with a very limited resource, while the husbands were very much aloof from these hardships which the mothers faced. So their lives was very distressful. But Adaku emerged out as a new age mother. According to the new age mother, Bushlam in his Time article said that the corporate mothers, when they are sacrificing a certain part of their profession to raise a child, they raise it in such a way that they make sure that the child rise up like a blue chip stock price, like a stock price they rise up. So Adaku in the mid 20th century wife did the same thing. She left her husband, she left her respect. Then she somehow managed money and started a small business which later flourished for the betterment of her daughters. So she at that time became a successful female entrepreneur. She remains unsubscribed because she also takes care of her desires. So she gets into unmarried relationships, but which was not the custom at that time. But for fulfilling her desire to remain uncircumcised, she does that. And she at the time starts a business. She looks after her daughter, and she also remains uncircumcised. That is, she fulfills her desire. So Adaku was totally a new age corporate mother. Imechita imagined it long ago. So that is very unhooding. So these mothers were hooded by number of problems. So keeping the short time limit in mind, I could not throw light on all the problems. So Imechita also showed unhoodings. So how the mothers get unhooded in a novel. Ona's defiance. Ona defies her father and marries Akbari. No ego fights her husband Nafi and somehow arranges money by selling cigarettes and small things and for her child's education. Akunna's refusal. Akunna refused to marry Okoboshi and runs away with Chika. Chika also does not accept Akunna's father's bride price and Adaku's decision. Adaku decides to leave her respect, her husband's shelter for the betterment of her daughters. So this way they are unhooded from the marginalization, from the subjugation. They throws off their hood and look into the light. So through this, I will conclude by saying that Imechita tried to tell that mothering is not mythology. It is only physiology and psychology. So mothering should not be based on the traditional myth. It should be based on the psychology, like Adaku did, and physiology. It should be done according to a physiological and psychological capacity, minus the mythological stigma. Thank you.
Thank you, Chandra. With this, we come to the end of the session 6 of this webinar. If any of you have any questions, you can feel free to ask. Any of you have any questions? So, should we end it, Srijay?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Since nobody is asking question, we can end it.
Yes. So, thank you, respected speakers. We were enriched by your speeches and your thoughts on African literature and orature. So, hope to interact with you again in the future. And thank you, Srijay, for assisting me so well. Thank you. So, we are leaving.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you to the organizers. Thank you.
Thank you.